first video of 2019. I hope you all had a good Christmas and New Year's. I'm here today to talk to you about the new Crucial P1 SSD. This is one of the first to market SSDs using a new type of NAND called QLC. There doesn't seem to be a lot of information about this on the internet because it's a relatively new product, I guess. And I've taken a bit of a punt, purchased one for my main gaming rig here because I needed some new storage, and it seemed like a good price, considerably cheaper than your normal NVMe SSDs. For what I want to use it for, it seems like a good choice. Get into that in a bit more detail, but it seemed like a good price, so I'm going to fit it into my machine, run some benchmarks, and tell you a bit more about how it performs. Give you a bit of an idea of why I've gone for this. This machine here I built just a little over a year ago as a gaming machine. As you can probably see, it's quite a clean build. Basically, when I built it, I didn't want any mechanical storage, and I've run out of space now. Games are getting bigger and bigger. Typical AAA titles now like 60 gigabytes. And I built this machine with purely SSD storage. I went for a NVMe Samsung SSD as my boot drive, 250 gig 960 Evo. Lovely drive, very fast. Complemented that with a 500 gig drive that I already had, but it was a SATA drive, and thought that would be enough. Quite quickly ran out of space. 750 gig isn't really a lot of space when you're dealing with 60 gigs per game. Faced with a bit of a decision: do I cull some of my older games off, or do I buy another drive, or a bit of both? Didn't really want to be running more cables inside this build, and I've got a spare slot for another NVMe drive. So that seemed like a good choice. And looking around at prices, I saw the Intel 660p, which is the first of the new QLC drives to come out, and it seemed considerably cheaper than the other NVMe drives of similar capacities. So it got me thinking. I got quite curious about it. And then I saw that Crucial had also released their own, Micron basically make this drive, but it's under the Crucial brand, their own version, which apparently is technically the same drive, just with different firmware on it. And they're both at very competitive prices, so I've been watching the market for the last couple of weeks, seeing what was going on. I did actually place an order for an Intel 660p, but it got cancelled because the seller didn't have any stock, which was a shame. Shame on them. But the price of these seems to have been going up and down almost daily, and Amazon themselves sold this directly, shipped straight from Amazon, sold by Amazon. It was £135. It's a 1 terabyte drive. £135 in 2019 January for a terabyte of NVMe storage seems very cheap, but there is a reason. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the technical workings of QLC NAND, but Linus Tech Tips has done a very good video on the Intel 660p explaining the difference. Recommend watching that. I'll put a link in the description below. Basically what it means is that they're storing more bits in the NAND flash, so they don't need as many chips on the drive. If they don't need as many chips, it means it's cheaper to produce. If it's cheaper to produce, it means it's cheaper to sell. If it's cheaper to sell, then in theory, you're getting better value for your money. The problem is having QLC means that the writes are slower. They combat this by having a section of the NAND flash reserved as single layer, as like a sort of cache. Now that portion of the drive that they reserve for cache gets smaller the more data you put on the drive. So as the drive fills up, that cache gets smaller and smaller. So as your drive starts to get near full, you're going to start to find real performance hits. Now, from what I've seen so far, the performance under worst scenario, sort of worst case where you're writing directly to the QLC flash, he's probably about on par with your typical SATA SSD, and I'm happy with that. That's fine. Most of what this is going to be used for is installing games and then reading them. So the install is going to be a single write for several minutes, hours as it downloads off the internet. Now my internet connection is not blisteringly fast anyway, so I don't need a huge write speed, but I should still get pretty quick writes for the majority of the time. But most of what it's going to be used for is reading, and the read speeds are still very good for these drives. Not as fast as the fastest NVMe drives, but still should be considerably faster than the SATA equivalents. So I'm just going to pop this open so you can see what's inside the box. Very light, as you would expect. Just show you the front and the back of the box. Inside you get plastic sort of clamshell packaging. Not sure why you've got an empty space here, but you've got the drive here, like a gum stick. One thing worth pointing out, this is a 2280 size drive, or 2280, I don't know how you say that. Make sure your motherboard has mounting points for that size. It doesn't come with a mounting screw, so you need to make sure you've got one. I believe that's quite typical of NVMe drives anyway, but just worth pointing out. So you will need a screw to mount this into your motherboard before you can fit it. Pop it out of the pack. There's the drive. That's upside down. Hang on. There you go. So you can see it. There's the back of the drive. You can see it's only got chips on one side. Not really a lot to it. As well as that, you get a little instruction leaflet. Got some basic warranty information and a quick, well, not even a getting started guide, it's just a link to a web page. Let's have a look and see what that takes you to. So it's a generic SSD support page, and I guess you pick your SSD in your language. So I hate it when they do this. There's no UK English, just USA English, but I've been living with that all of my time with computers, so since the early 90s. Kind of used to that now. No firmware updates available, which means that the drive should have the latest firmware on it. There's a download for the Crucial Storage Executive. However, I've already got that on my machine because my secondary SATA SSD is a Crucial drive. It's an MX300. Got some installation guides. Kind of seems quite generic. They've got PDF installs for 2.5-inch M-SATA, PCIe and SATA M.2 drives, which is funny seeing as I've selected the actual drive that I've got. Then there's some videos on how to use Crucial Storage Executive, how to install the drive, how to copy data, the data transfer utility, and links to the knowledge base. Yeah, fine. Okay, so I'm going to now open up my machine and I'm going to fit this drive, and then when we come back I'm going to do some benchmarks and show you how it performs. Okay, so I've been and rummaged through my box of bits and found this little packet here in my motherboard box, which has the very important mounting screw that I need. Now, where I'm going to install it is here in this slot. There are 2 slots for NVMe SSDs on this drive, on this motherboard. The second slot is underneath. You can't actually see it probably from this angle, but it's already got my Samsung drive in. It's also underneath a heatsink. These drives don't need heat sinks, but if you want to, they can run quite warm, so you can fit heat sinks to them. This board already comes pre-fitted with a heatsink for the bottom drive, because the slot is right next to the chipset, so the heatsink just extends over from the chipset. There's a section that comes off of the screw. Anyway, I digress. So the drive literally just pops into this slot here, so. Push it flat against the board, and yeah, as you can see that, well, you might not be able to see, that actually will be bending backwards if I put it against the board. So handily in the screw packet there's also a little riser they've included, so check your motherboard parts, screws, you might need a riser like this. Just going to pop that into the board. The holes on this board are quite handily marked for different length SSDs as well. 2242, 2260 and 2280. And quite handy for these sort of things, I've actually got a screwdriver here which has got a hex end on it, which is just the right size for these sort of nuts. I'm going to pop that one in the end there and put it into the board. Yeah, that's nice and tight. Now if I pop the drive back in, that's a much better fit, sits nicely on that riser, and then I'll pop the screw in and we're done. There we go. That took a couple of minutes, and now I'm just going to put the side back on the PC. In fact, no, I'm not going to put the side back on the PC. I'm going to boot it first and make sure it boots okay. Go straight into the BIOS settings here, just so we can check what's going on. Here's an important thing you might want to check. When you put an M.2 drive into your motherboard, the M.2 slots have two different protocols they support. You can get M.2 SATA drives and you can get M.2 NVMe drives. And the NVMe drives go straight into PCI bus, and the SATA drives go onto the SATA bus. Now there's a massive difference in the amount of bandwidth available. Your motherboard may only support SATA. If it supports NVMe, you need to check A, that it's set to use that support, otherwise it won't recognise an NVMe drive, and B, check how many PCI lanes are applied to it, because on this particular board there's two slots. The first slot will accept PCIe or NVMe drives or SATA drives. So the first slot will take both drives. That is already populated with my Samsung drive, so I know that one's working. The second slot has a different setting for how many PCI lane or PCI Express lanes are allocated to it. At the moment it's on X2 mode. That means there's only 2 lanes available, and that will limit the amount of bandwidth. So you need to change that to X4. Now I'm going to leave it at X2 for a moment, just so I can run a benchmark and show you what the difference is. But on your machine you want to just check these settings. Each motherboard is going to be different, you might not have these settings, but if you do, make sure that it's configured properly to get the maximum performance out of your SSD. Okay, so the drive is being recognised. I can see it here under the boot list as a CT1000 P1 SSD. There's my Crucial X300 SATA drive, and there's my Samsung 960 EVO 250 gig. So I'm going to jump out of here, boot Windows. Okay, so the drive's installed. I've partitioned it. I've put a single partition on. So now we've got 931 gig of space here. Crucial Storage Executive is recognising the drive, saying it's in good health. 0.22 gigabytes used. It's giving me a warning telling me that the default NVMe driver is in use. Okay, so I've had a look and I can't actually see where I'm supposed to change this driver. Basically, the Crucial Storage Executive is telling me the default NVMe driver is in use. You are currently using the default NVMe driver for this device. For optimal performance and full software feature support, you should install the official vendor NVMe driver. What does it mean by official vendor? Crucial don't provide drivers for these devices. My motherboard is a Asus Prime Z370A, They don't seem to provide any NVMe drivers, so where do I get any other NVMe drivers other than the ones that are being used currently, which are the default Microsoft ones? We go into Device Manager. There it is. The driver being used is a Microsoft driver. I mean, it's dated 2006. I don't know. That's the same one my Samsung's using, I assume. Let's check that again. So, not sure what it means by that, but if you have any thoughts, let me know in the comments below. I'd be interested to know. So anyway, I'm going to run with that for the moment. I'll run some benchmarks and see where we go. So I'm going to start by using Crystal Disk Mark. Just zoom in a little so you can see the screen properly. I'm going to run the default set of benchmarks. First going to run them on my new Crucial drive, and I'll run them on the Samsung and on my SATA SSD, Crucial MX300, so you can see what the difference is. Now, bearing in mind I'm currently running with only 2 PCI Express lanes, so I'm going to also increase that to 4 so we can see the difference. Bearing in mind at the moment, this is on a completely empty drive, so I'll run the benchmark now and see where we get. So the benchmarks are finished. I'm actually quite happy with this. So what we've got is sequential reads speeds of up to 1614 megabytes a second, and sequential write of up to 1499.5 megabytes a second. Now they're quite close to the advertised speeds. They claim up to 2000 megabytes a second write and 1700 megabytes a second read. I suspect the reason we're getting lower than that mostly is down to the fact that we're only using 2 PCIe lanes at the moment. That's with 1 thread and 32 length queue. Then 4 KB random reads 695, 4 KB random writes 984. Very good speeds. That's with a queue of 8 and 8 threads, and then with a single thread and a 32 queue of 32, random reads of 488, random writes of 380, and finally 4 KB random reads and writes with a single queue length and a single thread, 61 megabytes read and 167 megabytes write. So I'm pretty happy with those. I mean, the 4K random read and write speeds are quite a bit higher than what you could even theoretically get with a SATA SSD, and the sequential read and write speeds are massively higher than what you can get with a SATA drive. So I'm just going to run the same benchmark against my Samsung Evo now, bearing in mind that is 80% full, so it's recommended that you never fill up an SSD, or probably any drive really. The Samsung 960 Evo that I've got, that's using TLC NAND, so it still has some performance overheads, but let's run that and see what the difference is, bearing in mind that should in theory be significantly faster as it's a high performance drive, but a lot more expensive per gigabyte. Okay, so I've run benchmarks on all 3 drives now, and I'm just going into the BIOS and changing the PCI Express mode up to X4, so I'm using 4 PCI Express lanes now for this second slot. So that's the option there, M.2 _2, so that's a second slot, PCIe bandwidth configuration, X2 or X4, so set that to X4. And then save changes and reset. Okay, and now I've come back into the Crucial Storage Executive, and you can see on the CT1000P1 our PCIe lane width is showing as 4, which means it's being detected in the OS. It's using all 4 lanes now. Just zoom in so you can see that. Just here. So we're just finishing up the final run of benchmarks here with the 4 PCI Express lanes, and you can already see, looking at the sequential read and write times, we've gained quite a lot of performance just by increasing those PCIe lanes. So it's very important to make sure, if you can, that you've got those settings correctly on your set on your motherboard, so it's using the maximum number of PCI Express lanes for that NVMe slot. So that's the final set of benchmarks taken. I'm just going to bring them all up so we can compare. Okay, so we've got all of the test results here now. I just want to compare them so you can see. Now, first of all, this is the first set of test results I took. They may be slightly different to the ones you saw in the video earlier because I forgot to take a screenshot, so I've had to run the test again. But these are stock speeds, and these are the results I just got when I increased it to 4 PCI Express lanes. So you can see that the sequential read and write speeds have increased significantly. We're now getting just over the 2,000 megabytes a second read speeds that they quoted in their marketing material, and nearly 1,700 megabytes a second write speeds that they quoted. So that's a good result. The 4K read and writes are almost the same. The write speeds slightly increased with 8 threads. Now, single thread 32 QDepth, you see the read and writes are slightly slower. I'm not sure why that is, but it could just be within the boundaries of the test. I'm not sure. The same with the single Q, but either way, they're pretty decent results. These are the results from my Samsung Evo 960. You'll see that the read and write speeds are, well, the read speed sequential is significantly higher. Write speed's actually slower. Now that's interesting, but the 960 is an older drive, so I guess really to get a more accurate comparison, you'd be better off comparing it against a 970. But I don't want to have one of those to hand, so I think that's a good result there. The 4K random read and writes with a queue of 8 and 8 threads, you can see the Samsung there, that's where it excels. It's significantly faster reading. In fact, it's nearly double the speed, and the writes are slightly faster as well. 4K single thread 32 QDepth, we're not looking massively different, and the same on the single Q single thread. Slightly faster writes, slightly slower reads. Interesting to me, but all in all, I think these are pretty decent results. I think I'll be happy with the performance of this drive. And then here we have the Crucial MX300 for comparisons. This is a SATA SSD, and you can see that the read and write speeds are significantly slower, and that's because we're limited by the SATA bus. Same with the 4K across the board. In fact, it's significantly slower. So you know, the Crucial P1 is much faster. Now there's a couple of other test results I want to show you here. So first of all, here's some test results from the Samsung 960 when it was empty or near empty, 13% full. Now you can see the read and write sequential speeds are slightly higher. Again, the Crucial P1 is running out on write speed. 4K read and writes faster again. The 32 QDepth read and writes are significantly faster. So you can see what happens to the performance when the drive's full. It does start to take a hit, but it's just for comparison. And these final set of results here, these are from an older version of Crystal Diskmark, so the tests aren't actually the same. But these are from my MX300 when it was almost empty. Similar sequential read and writes. The important one that's worth looking at here, these are some test results when I've enabled Crucial's Momentum Cache. Now, because it's a SATA SSD, these read and write speeds are not possible. But what it does is it uses some of your system RAM as a cache. Writing and reading directly to the system RAM, you get massive performance boosts. But you'll see, even reading directly from RAM, the read speeds for sequential reads are not actually that much faster than a 960 reading directly from itself. So it shows how much performance increase you're getting going to an NVMe SSD. Nearly as fast to read from as RAM. Yeah, so there you go. Anyway, I'm going to close these down because I think what we need to do now is look at whether we can simulate a performance hit by running out of that SLC cache. So I said before, QLC NAND, this is what this drive's using. So it's a quad level cell NAND, which basically means that it can hold 4 different bits of data for every 1 bit that you store in SLC flash, single level. But it means that it's slower. I said before, go and have a look at Linus Tech Tips video for a better explanation. But it means that it's using a portion of the NAND chips or a portion of the storage as cache. If we run out of that cache, the performance should take a massive dive. Now, that is a cache that gets flushed automatically by the drive. So in normal everyday day-to-day use, you're not going to run out of it, and if you do, you just give the drive a moment or so to recover, flush out the cache, and then it will be back to normal performance. So I don't think I'm going to have any performance issues with this drive, but that's in this kind of use case scenario where I'm using it for storing a games library. If you had a heavy demanding workload where you were constantly writing to the drive, this probably wouldn't be the right drive for you, but that's what you're basically getting by or what you're giving up by getting that saving in the cost of the drive in the first place. So I'm going to try and copy a large volume of data to the drive and see what happens to the write speeds. So we found the install folder here for Assassin's Creed Origins, which is nearly 50 gigabytes. So I'm going to copy that from my Samsung onto the Crucial, see what happens to sustained speeds. I mean, that's amazing. It starts at over 1 gigabyte a second. I guess that's going to be with large files. The watch is hovering around 530 megabytes a second now. Well, that was quite impressive. I guess the sustained transfer writes for the smaller files were going around 500 megabytes a second, which is considerably lower than the maximum write speed of the drive. But do you know what? I'm actually really happy with that. I'm not really sure what else I could expect from the drive. Let's try and copy another game over Watch Dogs. So that's 1.34 gigabytes a second. It's just crazy write speeds. I mean, for the price, I'm really pleased with the drive. So the 13 gigabyte or 12.4 gigabyte file now. Let's just try and copy that straight. Single file. Boom. Yeah. So it starts at 1.6 and it gradually tapers off. So I guess that's the caching working there then. So we're hitting the cache, hitting the cache, hitting the cache, and then dropping down purely SLC QLC writes there. That was about a third of that, so 4 or 5 gigabytes of that transfer happened in about 5 seconds, and then it dropped down to complete the rest of the file, which I think, you know, I'm not going to be working with ginormous files. Let's just see for comparison. If I copy that again, interesting, but different results that time. Let me start a stopwatch so we can actually see what we're dealing with here. Wow. Don't know what happened there, but it dropped down to 2.7 megabytes a second. That's amazing. So that's almost all going into cache. That doesn't make any sense. That took 10 seconds. This is an interesting drive. It seems every time you perform a write, it behaves differently. I wonder if there's any way of seeing what the cache is doing, because I would imagine, I think I read somewhere that it starts with about 70 gig of cache, which means that a 13 gig file should be hitting the cache constantly, but I've previously written nearly 100 gigabytes of data by copying over several large folders. So I wonder if it's been moving that out of cache into the QLC cells in the background, so the cache isn't available. Interesting. So let's try one more time. So we've gone from 25 seconds to 10 seconds. Out of cache, really slow, 1.7, 2.7 megabytes. And then jumping back up again, 430 megabytes a second. It's where I would expect it to hit. I'm not sure what's causing this drop down to 2 megabytes a second. Right, so that took 27 seconds that time. So let's just see how long it takes to write that to the SATA SSD, just for comparison. So 27 seconds to beat. So we're averaging about 440 megabytes a second there, which is considerably slower, but it's still not bad. I mean, that's still SSD speeds, but SATA SSD, not NVMe SSD. Dropping more, down to 230 megabytes. Alright, so that took 29 seconds. Okay, so I don't really know exactly what's going on with this behaviour. We've seen some very interesting fluctuations in the write speeds when copying data, but from what I've been seeing just by looking at a couple of other reviews and information online, even at 500 megabytes, we're still probably writing to the SLC cache area on the drive. So I don't think we're running out of cache at that point. So what I'm going to do to run a serious test, I've just grabbed the 3 largest folders on my Samsung drive, which equates to just over 100 gig of data, 107, and I'm going to copy them into a new folder on the Crucial called test and see what happens to a sustained copy. I imagine it's going to start over a gigabyte a second, it's going to drop to 530, but I'm interested to see if after a sustained write it will drop significantly further than that. I'm expecting maybe under 100 megabytes by the end of it, but let's see what happens. So it started at 1.1, 1.3, 1.4 gigabytes, and then we're starting to drop down into 5. So there's that 530 megabytes a second write speed we were looking at originally. So it looks like there's some small cache that it used to really accelerate the write speeds initially. Now we're starting to drop below that. Okay, but we are doing lots of small files here. So we've dropped into single figures of megabytes a second, but it's a lot of small writes, so I don't think that's a very accurate test at that point. Back into larger files, and we're hitting a gigabyte a second again. So down to, it's an interesting test, but it's not really showing me anything meaningful. Different mixed workload of small files and large files is giving me, as expected, varying write speeds, but we're not able to really draw any conclusions from this. Peaking at 1.4 gigabytes a second again. That's impressive write speeds for large files. And that's the file that we were just playing with before. I think we may need to pull out some synthetic benchmarks to test this further. Yeah, so you're still copying large files and we're hovering around 530 megabytes. There we go. Right, so that's a large file there, and we've dropped down to 77, 78 megabytes a second. So I think that's the point at which it's run out of SLC cache. Now whether it's going to be able to do any shuffling of data while this transfer is still going on, I don't know. Probably not. Which means that we're probably not going to go above 70 megabytes for the remainder of this transfer. Yeah, so we had copied nearly 70 gigabytes. Well, no, actually, it was about 70 gigabytes, which ties in with what I was saying earlier, that I believe it had a 70 gigabyte SLC cache. Now, in real world scenarios, day-to-day usage, average consumer workload, you're not going to do that. How often do you write more than 100 gig or more than 70 gig at a time to the drive? So that's its extreme case, but under normal scenarios, this drive seems to perform really well, and I think for the price, I really can't see any reason not to buy it for a consumer workload. So at the moment, we're looking at write speeds comparable to that of a mechanical hard drive, which is not great, but bearing in mind that this is not a scenario likely to hit in day-to-day use, the majority of the time, the drive is going to be much quicker than this, and typically you're going to be seeing over 500 megabytes a second, right? And for this use case, and probably most use cases, as it's a larger drive, you're going to be using it to do reads. So there you have it. The Achilles heel of the QLC flash drives is the large sustained transfers. It's nearly finished now, only about another 15 seconds left, but as I'd suspected, it has stayed at around 70 to 80 megabytes a second sustained which is like a speed of a mechanical drive, but that's only for a third of the transfer. Up until that point, it was significantly faster. So that's finished now, and I imagine the drive will now continue working in the background to flush out like cache. Yeah, so unless you're planning to do long sustained writes to the drive, I don't see any reason not to go for a QLC, but that's obviously the Achilles heel there. So let's just have a look at prices as of today, which is the 19th of January. If we grab SSDs, let's go for M.2 2280s, and we want to only be looking at terabyte drives. So we can get the Intel 660. So this is a tricky one here. We're going to see some SATA SSDs creeping in, but Crucial P1 there is $135.98, which is exactly what I paid for it. Now the Intel 660p, interestingly, they've got it down at £121 from CCL. Now that is a very good price, but as you can see, that's not the price that you actually see when you click through to the site. So I think we can ignore that as a red herring. So we're looking at 140 quid there, 135 for the Crucial P1. To go for a comparative SSD that's not QLC, let's have a look. Like the Intel 760p here, you're looking at nearly £200. So you're saving 60 to 70 pounds. No, 60, yeah, about 60 quid off the price by going for a QLC drive at this sort of capacity, which is a significant saving. And to be honest, in normal everyday use, I don't think you're going to be able to notice the difference. So I give it a thumbs up. I'd recommend it. I love NVMe SSDs. I'm going to pull the camera out a moment just so that you can see what we're dealing with here. As you can see, installed in the PC, there it is. It just fits neatly and it doesn't upset the aesthetic of the build. So if you've got a desktop where you can actually see the components and you want a clean build, they're great. No cables to run, and the performance is still significantly faster than a SATA SSD in most use cases, and I think it's great. So there we go. Thanks for watching.